Sears, Roebuck and Company built its headquarters campus at Homan Avenue and Arthington Street on the west side of Chicago beginning in 1906, eventually expanding the complex to approximately 40 buildings across an industrial site whose mail-order fulfillment operations made it, at its peak, the largest commercial building complex in the world. The figure of 800 acres that circulates in popular accounts of the Sears campus refers to the combined scale of the original Homan Square complex and the company's broader Chicago area, industrial and distribution footprint at its mid-century peak, when Sears employed tens of thousands of workers across its catalog fulfillment, merchandising, and corporate administration operations centered on the West Side facility. This was not the Sears Tower documented in Case File 033. The Sears Tower was the company's downtown corporate headquarters, completed in 1973 as a monument to institutional confidence at the precise moment the company's competitive position was beginning its long deterioration. The Homan Square campus was the operational engine that had made the Sears Tower's construction possible. The physical infrastructure of the mail order and catalog business that had built Sears into the largest retailer in the United States across the first half of the 20th century, before that business model's relevance to American retail began its own separate decline. Sears closed its mail-order catalog operations in 1993. The Homan Square complex had already been substantially vacated by that point, as the company's operations had progressively relocated and consolidated through the preceding decades. Sears, Roebuck and Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in October 2018, 25 years after the catalog business that the Homan Square campus had been built to house had already been discontinued. The forensic entry point for this case is the relationship between an industrial campus's obsolescence and a company's eventual bankruptcy, separated by a quarter century during which the physical infrastructure of the company's original competitive advantage had already been abandoned while the company itself continued operating, declining, and searching for a competitive identity that the abandonment of its original physical infrastructure had not provided. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. The Homan Square campus's decline preceded Sears' broader corporate decline by decades, and the specific sequencing of that relationship is the forensic mechanism this case file examines. Sears' mail-order catalog business, the business that the Homan Square campus had been built to house, began its competitive decline in the 1970s as the retail format that had made Sears the dominant American retailer of the early 20th century. Mail-order catalog sales to rural and small-town American households who lacked convenient access to urban department stores became progressively less relevant as American suburbanization, automobile ownership, and the development of shopping mall retail formats provided alternative access to the merchandise selection that had previously been available only through the Sears catalog. The covenant that Sears management had not read carefully enough in the decades following World War II was the one embedded in the relationship between the catalog business's competitive advantage and the broader transformation of American retail geography that suburbanization and automobile ownership were producing. The catalog business's competitive advantage had been access, the ability to reach customers whose geographic isolation from urban retail centers made catalog shopping their most practical option for accessing the breadth of merchandise that Sears' catalog provided. Suburbanization eliminated that geographic isolation for an increasing proportion of the American population. Across the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, as the shopping mall retail format, anchored by department stores including Sears' own retail division, brought the merchandise breadth that catalog shopping had previously uniquely provided to suburban customers whose automobile ownership made mall access convenient. Sears' retail division adapted to this transformation by building its own mall anchor store network, a transition that the company executed with substantial commercial success across the mid-20th century. Sears' catalog division and the Homan Square campus that the catalog division's fulfillment operations required did not have an equivalent adaptation available. The catalog business model's competitive advantage was being eliminated by the same suburbanization trend that the company's retail division was successfully exploiting. The Homan Square campus's progressive obsolescence across the decades preceding its 1993 catalog closure was therefore not a failure of Sears management. It was the predictable consequence of a retail format whose competitive advantage a broader demographic transformation had eliminated, while the company's separate retail division business successfully adapted to and profited from the same transformation. At what point does a company's successful adaptation in one business division obscure the terminal decline that an unrelated business division within the same company is simultaneously experiencing? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal of the Homan Square campus across the decades of its operational decline reflects a specific category of real estate valuation challenge that this channel has not previously examined in this precise form: the valuation of purpose-built industrial infrastructure whose specific functional configuration, designed for a single company's specific operational requirements at a specific historical moment, has no equivalent alternative use that the broader commercial real estate market can readily absorb. The Homan Square buildings were configured for catalog fulfillment operations at a scale and with a specific functional layout, including extensive internal rail spurs, specialized material handling infrastructure, and building configurations optimized for the specific logistics of early to mid-20th century mail-order fulfillment that had no direct equivalent use case in the commercial real estate market of the late 20th century, when the catalog business's decline made the campus's continued use for its original purpose commercially unjustifiable. The appraisal challenge that the Homan Square campus's obsolescence created parallels the appraisal challenge documented in Case File 030's examination of the Pontiac Silverdome, a purpose-built facility whose value was almost entirely dependent on its continued use for the specific function it had been designed to serve, and whose value upon the discontinuation of that function approached the bare land value of the site, net of the substantial demolition costs that clearing obsolete purpose-built industrial infrastructure of this scale requires. Sears management across the decades of the Homan Square campus's decline faced a specific decision that the appraisal challenge created: whether to invest in demolition and site clearance to realize the underlying land value, whether to pursue adaptive reuse redevelopment that would require substantial capital investment with uncertain commercial prospects, or whether to allow the campus to remain in its obsolete and partially vacant condition while the company's broader corporate strategy addressed more immediately pressing competitive challenges in its retail division. The company's actual response was a combination of all three approaches applied to different portions of the campus across different periods, reflecting the absence of a coherent long-term strategy for an asset whose original commercial purpose had been eliminated decades before the company itself entered bankruptcy. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The Sears retail division's eventual competitive decline, which produced the company's 2018 Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing, was a substantially separate institutional failure from the Homan Square campus's decades earlier obsolescence, connected to it primarily through their shared corporate parent rather than through a direct causal relationship. The retail division's decline reflected the competitive pressures that this channel has documented in multiple case files examining American retail's late 20th and early 21st century transformation. The discount retail competition from Walmart and Target that progressively eroded Sears' market position from the 1970s onward, the e-commerce disruption that Amazon and other online retailers produced from the late 1990s onward, and the specific financial engineering of the 2005 merger with Kmart under Edward Lampert's ESL Investments, whose subsequent management of the combined company prioritized real estate monetization and financial extraction over the retail competitiveness investment that the company's deteriorating market position required. The institutional denial embedded in the Sears bankruptcy trajectory was therefore distributed across two separate timeframes and two separate institutional failures that happened to share a corporate identity. The first denial occurred in the mid-20th century, when Sears management allowed the catalog division's competitive obsolescence to proceed without a coherent strategy for the Homan Square campus's physical infrastructure, a denial whose consequences were primarily borne by the West Side Chicago community, whose economic relationship with Sears the campus's decline progressively eliminated. The second denial occurred in the early 21st century, when Sears management under the Lampert ownership structure prioritized real estate monetization and financial extraction from the retail division's remaining assets over the competitive investment that might have allowed the retail division to better compete with the discount and e-commerce retail formats that were eliminating its market position. Those two denials, separated by approximately half a century, both contributed to the same corporate entity's eventual 2018 bankruptcy filing, but they were institutionally and causally distinct failures, whose connection is primarily that they occurred within the same corporate boundary across different historical periods and under different management philosophies. The Homan Square campus had already failed by the time the broader Sears retail collapse began. The campus's failure was not the cause of the broader collapse. It was a separate, earlier, and largely unrelated institutional failure that happened to share a name. The Homan Square campus has been the subject of redevelopment efforts since the 1990s, led by community development organizations and Chicago civic institutions whose work has converted portions of the historic complex to mixed-use purposes, including residential, educational, and community service facilities, while other portions of the original campus have been demolished. The redevelopment of Homan Square has been documented as one of the more successful examples of large-scale purpose-built industrial campus adaptive reuse in American urban redevelopment history, reflecting decades of sustained community development investment in a West Side Chicago neighborhood, whose economic relationship with Sears' original campus had defined its identity for most of the 20th century. What the Sears Roebuck campus case reveals in the context of this channel's 65-case archive is a specific category of institutional failure sequencing that this channel has not previously documented with this precision. A company whose eventual corporate bankruptcy was preceded by decades by the obsolescence and effective failure of a separate, earlier business division whose physical infrastructure had already been substantially abandoned before the broader corporate decline began. The Sears Tower case in Case File 033 documented the company's corporate headquarters, built in 1973 at the moment of the company's maximum institutional confidence, and sold in 1994 as the company's competitive decline accelerated. This case documents the company's operational origin, the Homan Square campus, whose obsolescence preceded the Sears Tower's construction and whose decline had already been substantially completed by the time the broader corporate bankruptcy that ended Sears' independent existence occurred. The campus that built Sears failed first. The headquarters that expressed Sears' confidence failed second. The retail division that had once successfully adapted to the same demographic transformation that had doomed the catalog business eventually failed last. 25 years after the catalog business it had once seemed to have successfully replaced had already been discontinued. 3 failures. 1 corporate name. Different decades. Different causes. If this case file changed how you evaluate the relationship between corporate divisional obsolescence and eventual broader institutional bankruptcy, subscribe because the next case examines a different industry's version of the same multi-decade decline sequence. And in the comments, given the Homan Square campus's documented obsolescence decades before Sears' broader bankruptcy, what specific corporate governance mechanism would have required earlier strategic acknowledgement of a business division's terminal decline rather than allowing decades of unaddressed physical infrastructure obsolescence? The case file is open. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication. Factual claims, interpretive framing, creative direction, and final content decisions reflect human judgment throughout. This disclosure is provided in accordance with platform transparency standards for AI-assisted content.